As you read, keeping order within these communities, because they're not public spaces, is a real challenge for these communities. They have to come up with their own set of laws and their own set of enforcement mechanisms, and their own way to police behavior in these places, because these residents are often loath to bring in public security guards. And one of the major problems there is controlling adolescents and controlling adolescent delinquency. Now, in these places, the service sector, these service jobs are increasingly transformed from personal, intimate relationships. I'm not saying that not to create any nostalgic picture here between servants and employers, but between these known relationships, these people, and these longer-lasting relationships, to the provision of things like cleaning, daycare, dog walking, and securitization within these neighborhoods on a wage labor basis, right? So just assigning people where the need is. This work tends to be more temporary. It tends to be, as a result, perhaps more exploitative, though that's a matter to discuss. And part of this increased formalization of this labor sector is in result of labor regulations since about the 1980s that led to an increase in part-time employment, and this increased desire to use these wage labor categorizations as a way to avoid having to pay the higher salary associated if someone was actually in the domestic sector. As you read, class distinctions are very important, often built into the architecture of these places, including the ubiquitous maids bathroom in many of these places, however small. And one thing that this leads to, I think that's interesting, is this increasing separation and fear of this poor, this mass public, yet together with that, this coterminous intense reliance on these individuals, right? And we'll see that with the security guard industry in particular. Now, another thing that is important here is that you need high-speed roads. This is Mexico City, and you need high-speed roads to connect these places to employment, to central cities. High-speed roads because you want to avoid, insofar as possible, as any violence on the road, any carjackings, which are a real threat in many of these places. And these roads are often cut through the city, cut through old neighborhoods, and allowing this transit of the middle class and the wealthy at the expense of the poor, who these roads are essentially irrelevant for, except for the fact when they bulldoze through their community. Roundabouts often favored on these roads because then you don't have to stop, also preventing carjacking. And what this leads to is this ability for residents to leave the central city, as you have in the United States, leave the central city and move to the side. However, not all wealthy and middle class residents in Latin America obviously have abandoned the city. There's this, in many places, this sense that these edge cities are stifled, boring environments. The commute is long, even on these high-speed roads. And so there are this continued interest in these securitized condominium towers within the city. And these often, as you saw on the slide of Caracas, this happens to be in Sao Paulo. Many of you might have seen this. This ran in the New York Times Magazine a few months ago, I believe. And you can see this just incredible spatial proximity between real luxury and then just tremendous poverty. And the reason why this is possible is that these are these highly securitized environments, but they also sell because they allow these residents to remain close to the central cities. Now, this process of securitization in the city in Latin America also extends to private homes within the city. You see this increase in fortification, where security becomes the #1 concern, both in building and in renovating and in the real estate market. You have, among some residents, this sense that there's been this fall, right? This fall of what was formerly a more open society, yet there's no real pushback to this increased barring, walling, and these buildings of these homes, according to this security logic. Here too, security becomes a status symbol, right? So you in many ways are trying to keep up with what you believe your station deserves in terms of securitization. And you see, as in the United States, this move to privatize public roads and other public spaces within the city. Now, the case of Europe. and really what we should be talking about here is a difference between Western Europe and this post-socialist cities. I think that there's a real distinction to be made here. And what you see is disaggregated crime trends here for Western Europe. But what you can see is this increase in crime in this period. And so securitization, though, predates this increase in crime, as you have in Latin America and in the United States. And so security, this is in South England here, security as this marker of prestige in this same sort of tiered system, right? So, all the way from these fortified individual residences all the way down to just a simple guarded town park, right? Or housing park, these homes for the working class. And particularly in Eastern Europe, as we talked about, where the police have been seen to be ineffective, you get this tremendous rise of the security industry and this rise in many ways of this sort of vigilante, individual private citizen policing of these neighborhoods and their enforcement of these norms. And so that's something to think about is how order is kept in the city and sort of what the trade-off there is in between individual liberties and these sort of communal sense of security, communal sense of values. And as you read in this, what's famously known as the Broken Windows article, this Broken Windows hypothesis, this is a pervasive notion that to protect a community, what you need is, in some sense, the sacrifice of some of these individual rights. Now, in these areas, particularly in the post-socialist cities, one thing that happens is this increasing abandonment of public transit and increasing abandonment of certain spaces for others, and so you get a real polarization of space, certain defended elite spaces versus these spaces that are allowed to deteriorate and decline because there's not investment flowing into them. And so you end up with these highly defended, highly defensible parts of the city, and then these more open areas that are allowed more to decline. And you see this the rise of this defensive aesthetic in the same way that you do in Europe, in the United States. Now, as you heard in the Global Cities lecture, the rise of these cities, we tend to think about them in terms of their most visible, or what may be to us their most visible elite residents, the sort of the commanders in these command cities. But the growth of these cities, the structure that they take in the logic, depends just as much on the people who provide the services, right, and who provide much of the security in these places, in the case of securitization. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the guard industry and where these people come from and who they are and what this looks like. And so in Europe, and what you're looking at here is in 2005 a breakdown disaggregated of the number of security companies and staff on the top, and then the bottom here you're looking at just general trend in Europe. So this is the private security industry. And what you can see is this tremendous growth of the security industry, both in terms of numbers and in terms of profit, right? This became this very profitable sector that many firms try to move into. This same thing is happening in the United States. To take Los Angeles, for example, from 1980 to 1990, so just 10 years there, the private security industry increased from about 24,000 to 75,000. So you have this tremendous growth. But none of this matches what happens in Latin America. And so you're looking here the size of the private security industry in Latin America in about 2005 here. And so if we take Guatemala as an example, which Guatemala City happens to be the most dangerous city in terms of real risk of violence in Latin America, and think about where this rise of the private security industry comes from and who is providing this security. Now, the neoliberal reforms, as we know, in the 1980s, they led to this collapse of the industrial production, domestic industrial production in Guatemala, and the lifting of protections for these domestic manufacturers, an increase in informal economies in cities, and an increase in crime as these surplus populations moved to cities unable to find work. Now, this led to an increase in violence in the cities. In 2008, fully 50% of Guatemalans surveyed reported having, in the last 2 years, having an immediate family member victimized by crime, being an assault or otherwise robbed. So this just the highest rate of victimization in Latin America. And what this leads to is an increase in demand for security. Now, in 2000, there were 68 private security companies in Guatemala. By 2006, there are 128. So you can see this near doubling there, right, in only 6 years. In addition to these regulated firms, you have about 60,000 guards working for unregulated firms, unregistered firms. So you have about 90,000 private security guards in Guatemala in a country where the police force number is 20,000. So you just this dwarfing of this public provision of security for this private security. So who are these guards? Where do they come from? In the case of Guatemala, they often come from these poor agrarian, these rural regions. Guatemala has a tremendous amount of inequality in the distribution, in land distribution. It has a Gini coefficient in its land distribution. You remember this coefficient of about 0.75. So that's enormous and far surpassing the 0.4 threshold that the UN sets for at what point security starts to deteriorate and society starts to deteriorate. And the poor in these areas have for a long time relied on some form of wage labor, some sort of temporary wage labor to supplement their rural, their agrarian lifestyles. And the security industry is only the latest of these options for these people. And in the same way that many of these older jobs relied on these informal networks from cities, from rural villages to cities, the security industry in the same way draws these guards through these networks. And the security industry offers guards a chance of employment in the city, a chance to earn wages, as well as a chance to experience, for many of these guards, what they articulate as a chance to experience life in the city. Right now, that comes with its own serious drawbacks, including a tremendous amount of discrimination toward these guards. So you have one guard here, your typical guard on the street here in Guatemala. So they have to learn how to navigate these city landscapes, and on their days off, they might enjoy parts of this city that are much more modern than the villages that many of them come from, but they're also subject to intense discrimination and racism, and often excluded from the very spaces that they are during the week hired to police. So you can see this disjuncture here between what these people are being paid to do and sort of what their class, what people determine that their class entitles them to. Wages and qualifications for these jobs are very low. So to become a security guard in Guatemala requires about between 2 days and 1 week of training. So I mean, really hardly any training at all. Guards earn between 160 and 350 US dollars per month as guards. So that's compared to maybe about 120 they might earn working for an agriculture or a livestock company, or 150 or so they might earn on a palm plantation. And so you can see that this is a better form of wage labor, but not that much better. And guards rate their jobs below such things as like bricklayers in city, and far below the industrial jobs that many of them take these guard posts to try to move up to. Wages paid twice a month. That's another nice feature of the security industry, because it's regular in its pay, and guards send most of this money, or at least half of this money, home to support their families. The costs of living in the city are very high, and this is the case for guards across Latin America. Guards often have to pay to live in these dormitories, and provided by the security companies. So the security companies getting some of that money back. They also get that money back by selling the guards medicines in these commissaries, which are these company stores basically selling just caffeine pills masquerading as medicine. And they're forced to buy much of their food on the street, very expensive, about $2 a day. And so you remember, say if they're earning $200 a month, they're sending half of that home. $2 a day on food becomes actually a tremendous expense and prevents more saving there. And the labor pool is very deep, and so companies are able to exploit these guards by doing such things as forcing them to work uncompensated overtime, and forcing them to deduct costs like training and uniforms from their salaries. And as a result, turnover in the guard industry in Latin America is quite high. This works both in the guards, to the disadvantage of the guards, but also to the advantage in some ways. These guards are able to exploit the number of firms, or take advantage of, I should say, the number of firms. And so If there's such things as a birth or a death in the family, they can return to their village, quit their job, and then when they return, just apply at a different company. And you see this in surveys that many of these people do this. And what this leads to, and so in the same way that you have this increased reliance or this intense reliance on these poor residents in these walled cities, in these city of walls that are meant to defend themselves in many ways from these poor residents. In the case of the guards, you have essentially this this allowing of the what are considered the very, very low class to control the movements of the most wealthy. Now, as you remember from the reading, this idea of control is entirely fictional, right? And there's moments where, many moments where these guards are incapable of enforcing the rules they've been hired to enforce on these elites who refuse to, for instance, show identification, refuse to submit to this process. So, but you do have this paradox of these lower class, what are considered these lower class, these poor residents, these people who are extremely disadvantaged in these neoliberal economies, being sort of at the center, but also invisible and ignored in many ways. In the U.S., this low pay, low qualification is the same story. In the 1990s, guards earned between $4 and $7 an hour. So you can see this really, it's the most visible individuals in this security economy are often some of the very poorest. Now, alongside the construction of these walled enclaves, what you end up with is public space inside cities increasingly privatized. So this is across our three regions, increasingly privatized in the last 4 decades. This idea of liberal reform in cities is replaced by this rhetoric of urban warfare. The needs of the poor and the middle class increasingly seen as irreconcilable. And public investment shifting away from these reform improvement projects to these highly selective privatized individual developments, seeking these urban renaissance projects, seeking these gentrification projects at the expense of the poor and the marginalized who can't use these spaces. And one very visible feature of this has been the triumph of the individual motorist over the last 40 years, over the last 50 years, over this more general public commuting infrastructure. You have here an ad from the mid-90s for the Chevy Blazer, which was at that time a cutting edge or one of the nicer SUVs. And you can see here just the first part of this copy here. The harshest roads aren't necessarily located in the boonies, and they're not tamed by cowboys named Hoss and Jake, but by people named Tony and Susan on the way home from the firm. And so you get this increasingly this sense that the city is this forlorn, essentially warscape that these people have to navigate from one defensible architecture, their law firm, to the other. Perhaps very likely Tony and Susan here were headed home to a walled city, to a walled community. And where you do have a renewed interest in public infrastructure and public transportation, you have these moves to essentially privatize insofar as possible these public infrastructure spaces, to exclude the marginal from these spaces. And so you may remember this from the Mike Davis reading that you had, that you have this, what happens is you have these twin projects of the privatization of elite sections to make them as attractive as possible to customers or to pedestrians and commuters through the provision of benches and fountains and other rest areas, and then the hardening of certain poor areas to exclude the homeless, exclude the marginal, and you lead to things that Davis calls these sadistic street environments. So this is the bench design that recently won for the new bench design in the Philadelphia subway system. And in the release, the press release talking about this new bench, the authors talked about how this bench would allow all these different sorts of postures for residents or for commuters waiting for their train, right? So you could sit here or perhaps perch, or even they had one person who you could kind of like sit up on the back of it, or like stand up and sit on the back here. And in one tiny oblique line in this press release, they say, oh, and it's also hard to lie down on. I mean, that this is like clearly the design of this is to prevent people from using this public space, right? People who are disadvantaged or otherwise excluded from this labor market, who can't afford housing in the